04:47 a.m. local time, Gulf of Oman, 41 nautical miles east of the Strait of Hormuz. A 78-foot luxury motor yacht named Meridian Star sat dead in the water with its running lights cut. 3 rigid-hulled inflatable boats had come up on her in the dark, engines throttled down to a low murmur, and a combined tactical team of ENCE agents, diplomatic security service personnel, and customs and border protection officers were already on her aft deck. The captain was on his knees in flex cuffs. The 2 crew members were face down on the forward sun deck. And in the lower salon, a CBP marine interdiction specialist named Hector Ruiz was on his hands and knees with a battery-powered reciprocating saw, cutting a rectangle through a teak-laminated floor panel that the manifest insisted was solid composite over a sealed freshwater ballast tank. The blade went through the laminate in 9 seconds, through the structural layer beneath it in another 11. And then it stopped, because the cavity underneath wasn't water. It was foam-packed cases, 62 of them in the first compartment alone. Each case sealed, each case numbered, each case containing components that, 21 hours later, an export control analyst at the Bureau of Industry and Security would identify as inertial measurement units, GPS-denied navigation modules, and forward section guidance assemblies consistent with the Shahed-136 and Shahed-238 attack drone families. The shipment, valued at $87 million at component replacement cost, was bound under falsified end-use documentation for a buyer in Bandar Abbas working on behalf of procurement officers attached to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. The Meridian Star had been classified on every customs document she had cleared as a private pleasure vessel. Retention, cont point, 0. 30 resolution Ts, hint at scale without spoiling. What investigators did not yet say out loud, on that deck at that hour, was that the Meridian Star was the second vessel pulled out of the same network in 72 hours. That 3 Texas marinas were being breached simultaneously, 4,000 miles away, by separate tactical teams. That the case had started not with a satellite intercept, not with a foreign intelligence handoff, not with a wiretap. It had started with one mechanic at a small marina in Galveston, who looked at a set of ballast readings on a clipboard and said, out loud, to no one in particular, these numbers are wrong. His name was Carlos Mendez. He was 51 years old. He had been a marine mechanic for 24 years, the last 16 of them at Pelican Cove Marina on the western edge of Galveston Bay, and on the morning of February 11, 2026, he was working a routine pre-departure inspection on a 72-foot motor yacht called Seaboard Pearl, that was listed for departure to Dubai under a luxury vessel export contract. The inspection was supposed to take 90 minutes. It took him 4 hours. And by the end of it, he had written a 1-page note in pencil on the back of a fuel receipt carbon, walked it into the marina office, and asked the dock manager for the phone number of the nearest Naval Criminal Investigative Service field office. The thing Mendez had noticed was simple. The vessel's trim was off. Not by a small amount. By what he later estimated in his witness statement at somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds, concentrated toward the keel. The ballast readings on the wheelhouse instrumentation said the freshwater tanks were 3/4 full. He had pumped them himself 2 days earlier at the owner's request, and he knew they were empty. The hull manifest, which he had asked to see when the trim numbers refused to make sense, listed the vessel's displacement at 142,000 pounds. The dockside scales, which he had access to because Pelican Cove rented slip space by certified weight, were reading the vessel at over 146,000. 4,000 pounds of mass were on board that the paperwork could not account for, and the mass was in the wrong place. Mendez was not a federal investigator. He was a mechanic. But he had spent 24 years putting his hands on the inside of boats, and he understood, in a way that someone with a desk and a degree might not, that a vessel that lies about its weight is a vessel that is hiding something physical. He filed the tip with NCIS at 3:42 p.m. on February 11. It received a tracking number. It was classified at the receiving desk as a low-priority maritime anomaly. It was placed in a review queue for processing within 72 hours. It sat there for 11 days. By the time a human analyst opened the file on February 22, the Seaboard Pearl was already at sea, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, headed for a transshipment port in the eastern Mediterranean. The opportunity to inspect her at dock was gone. The tip would, under normal departmental triage, have been closed out as untimely and archived. It was not archived. And the reason it was not archived is the first thing about this case that does not fit the comfortable version of how federal investigations begin. A piece of automated software, running on a server in a Customs and Border Protection facility in Virginia, had pulled the Seaboard Pearl's departure data out of a routine bulk feed 11 days after Mendez filed his tip and flagged the vessel for secondary review. The system was called the Automated Targeting System, and it was not designed to catch drone components. It was designed to catch bulk commodity sanctions violations, refined petroleum, dual-use chemicals, sometimes precious metals, by pattern-matching shipping behavior against historical sanctions evasion templates. Retention, chant point. 4. Gray stakes bend, introduce 14 marina complication. What the software had noticed was that the Seaboard Pearl's listed owner of record, a Delaware-registered holding company, had 3 commercial relationships with marinas that had appeared, in the previous 28 months, in 7 separate low-level sanctions inquiries. None of the inquiries had produced charges. None of them had been linked to each other. But the software did not care about charges. It cared about pattern. And the pattern said this vessel, this owner, this route, and this declared cargo class, luxury vessel export, end user undisclosed, final destination Dubai with a stated onward sale to a private buyer, was a configuration that matched, with a confidence score the system flagged in red, the historical signature of sanctions evasion. The analyst who pulled the flag was a 31-year-old contract analyst at the CBP National Targeting Center. Her name has not been made public. She cross-referenced the Seaboard Pearl's owner of record against a federal corporate relationships database and found that the Delaware holding company was a subsidiary of a Texas-registered limited liability company called Blue Horizon Maritime Services. Blue Horizon Maritime Services was described on its filings as a luxury vessel export brokerage. Its principal address was a 1-story office building in League City, Texas, 18 miles north of Galveston. Its registered owner was a 61-year-old man named Raymond Cast, who had been in the marina services business in the Houston-Galveston corridor since 1994. He owned, directly or through subsidiaries, 10% or larger equity stakes in 14 separate yacht club marinas distributed along the Gulf Coast from Port Aransas to the Florida Panhandle. Blue Horizon wasn't one location. The CBP cross-reference had found commercial relationships at 14 Gulf Coast marinas. Not 1, 14. And the task force was about to discover that wasn't even the full picture. The analyst's flag did not at that point generate an immediate operational response. It generated an interagency memo. The memo went on March 4, 2026, from CBP to NCIS to Homeland Security Investigations, to the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce, and to the Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Each agency assigned a desk officer. Each desk officer added what they had. NCIS had Mendez's 11-day-old tip now suddenly elevated. HSI had 2 open inquiries from 2023 and 2024 involving freight forwarders that had moved goods through Blue Horizon-affiliated docks. BIAS had a single unresolved technical data export concern from a 2022 audit that had referenced a Plano, Texas company in the avionics component sector, a company that, when the names were finally crosswalked, employed 2 of the people who would, 3 months later, be sitting in federal interview rooms. The operational lead on the case was assigned on March 11, 2026. Her name was Special Agent Dana Holbrook. She was 44, a 15-year NCIS veteran, and she had spent the previous 4 years working maritime sanctions cases out of the Norfolk Field office before transferring to Houston in late 2025. Holbrook later described the moment she opened the consolidated file as the moment she understood that the case was not, in fact, about a single yacht. The Mendez tip had been the first thread. Blue Horizon was the spool. I went through the open portions of the NCIS case file obtained through later FOIA requests. One internal memo from March 12, 2026 kept standing out. The supervising agent described Blue Horizon's documentation as exceptionally well prepared. Whoever built this had clearly studied how federal inspection workflows allocate resources. The memo went on to note that Blue Horizon's customs filings, its vessel survey reports, its end-use declarations, and its bank transfer documentation were not just compliant on their face. They were structured in a way that anticipated the questions a routine review would ask and answered them preemptively, in language that mirrored, almost word for word, the phrasing used in federal compliance guidance documents. That kind of documentation does not come from a small-time smuggler. It comes from someone who has read the regulator's playbook. The business model, once Holbrook's team had spent 6 weeks reverse engineering it from invoices, was elegant. Blue Horizon presented itself as a high-end vessel export brokerage. It bought used luxury yachts in the United States, generally in the 60 to 90-foot range, generally from estate sales, divorce sales, or distressed owners. It refit them at one of its affiliated marinas. It marketed them to international buyers through a small network of brokers in Dubai, Singapore, and Antalya. And it shipped them, fully fueled and seaworthy under their own power, to delivery ports where the new ownership took possession. That was the legitimate-looking surface. The export control filings were clean. The customs declarations were clean. The corporate paperwork was clean. On the surface, Blue Horizon was a moderately successful niche broker, moving between 40 and 60 vessels a year, generating between $30 and $40 million in declared revenue, paying taxes, employing 17 people, and renewing its commercial fishing and vessel services licenses on schedule. Underneath that surface was a transshipment service. The mechanism was that during the refit phase, typically 4 to 8 weeks before a vessel departed for international delivery, selected yachts had their ballast cavities, fuel tank, dead spaces, and structural void compartments modified. The modifications were small. A cutout here, a foam and resin reseal there. The work was done at night by a rotating crew of 3 to 5 contractors in slips at marinas where the security cameras had documented blind spots. The cargo that went into those cavities did not go through any customs declaration. It arrived at the marina by truck, often in shipments labeled as marine electronics or vessel accessories, and it was loaded into the cavities before the final hull seal was applied. The cargo was paid for separately in cryptocurrency conversions routed through 3 corporate layers in 3 different jurisdictions by a buyer that Blue Horizon's commercial records identified only as Noor Logistics International, a Dubai-registered freight forwarder. The yachts, with their hidden cargo, then departed under their own legitimate paperwork. They cleared U.S. customs as luxury vessel exports. They crossed the Atlantic. They reached their transshipment ports. And there the cargo was extracted, sometimes at sea by a tender that came alongside, sometimes at dock by a crew that knew exactly which floor panels to lift, and the yacht continued on to its declared buyer, refurbished, resealed, and intact, while the cargo went onward into a procurement chain that fed components and subassemblies into the Iranian drone program. Raymond Cast was visible. He signed documents. He had a LinkedIn profile. But the money funding Blue Horizon didn't come from Cast. It came from the other side of the world. And the address it pointed toward had appeared in U.S. intelligence assessments only once before, in connection with weapons procurement for Urge. The address belonged to a building in a commercial district of Dubai that housed 3 companies on paper and 1 operation in practice. Noor Logistics International was the visible front. Behind Noor sat 2 other shell companies, one registered in the Seychelles and one in the British Virgin Islands, that handled the financial flows. And behind those 2 shells sat a single coordinating individual whose name appeared on no document Holbrook's team could obtain through standard subpoena. He was identified eventually through a combination of cell tower data, hotel registrations, and 1 cooperating witness as a 46-year-old logistics manager named Victor Osei. Osei held a Ghanaian passport. He had lived in Dubai since 2018. He had no formal connection to the Iranian state. and he had, according to the cooperating witness, traveled to Tehran 9 times in the previous 4 years on a second passport that U.S. authorities never recovered. By late March 2026, Holbrook's task force had grown to 41 agents across 4 agencies. NCIS held the operational lead. HSI provided the surveillance infrastructure and the cross-border financial flow analysis. CBP provided the maritime interdiction capability and the targeting feeds. BIS provided the export control expertise that allowed the team to predict, with some accuracy, what categories of components a procurement network like this one would prioritize. The Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls provided the legal architecture for any future indictment. The FBI was briefed, but in an unusual organizational decision was not given operational authority, partly because the Maritime Nexus put NCS in the lead seat, partly because Holbrook had argued, successfully, that adding another agency would slow the targeting cycle below what the surveillance window would tolerate. The surveillance window was the issue. Blue Horizon, the task force assessed, was running between 3 and 5 active shipments at any given time. Vessels were being refitted at 5 of the 14 affiliated marinas: Pelican Cove in Galveston, Trinity Bay Marine in League City, Sabine Lake Yacht Harbor in Port Arthur, Aransas Pass Vessel Services in Aransas Pass, and a smaller facility on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. The departure cadence was roughly 1 vessel every 9 to 14 days. Each vessel, once it had left U.S. waters, was effectively unrecoverable. If the task force was going to do more than catch 1 vessel and watch the network reconstitute itself, it needed to identify the active shipments, the next out vessels, the cargo loading dates, and the destination link-ups, all in a window measured in weeks, not months. The surveillance began on April 6, 2026. 3 marinas, Trinity Bay, Sabine Lake, and Aransas Pass, were placed under simultaneous coverage. Coverage included static cameras on adjacent properties, mobile units rotating through public parking areas, Federal Aviation authorized drone overflights, and underwater hydrophone arrays placed at the channel mouths to capture vessel acoustic signatures. HSI's financial team was, in parallel, working a separate track on Blue Horizon's bank flows, trying to identify the next purchase of marine electronics that would, the task force believed, correspond to the next cargo loading event. The first major obstacle hit on April 19, 2026. The hydrophone array at Trinity Bay went offline. So did the array at Sabine Lake. Both failures were traced, eventually, to a manufacturer-assisted firmware update that had been pushed without proper field testing and had corrupted the device management software on roughly 30% of the units deployed in the Southern District. The arrays were dark for 31 hours. During that window, 2 vessels, both later identified as Blue Horizon affiliated, completed their refit phase and departed under their own paperwork. Neither was stopped. Neither was, at the time, even confirmed as having been carrying contraband, because the surveillance gap meant the task force could not document the loading event. The decision Holbrook faced on the morning of April 20 was whether to inspect a 3rd vessel, a vessel named Gulf Meridian, 81 feet, currently undergoing what the surveillance had documented as suspicious overnight work at Aransas Pass, knowing that any boarding would almost certainly tip the broader network that it was being watched. She inspected. The Gulf Meridian was boarded on the morning of April 22, 2026, under a search warrant predicated on the cumulative pattern evidence. The boarding team found in the vessel's portside ballast cavity 11 foam-packed cases containing what BIS later assessed as Shahed-series engine, control units, and a quantity of radio frequency seekers consistent with the terminal guidance package of an extended range variant. The component value was estimated at $14 million. The vessel was seized. The 2 crew members aboard, neither of whom had loaded the cargo, were detained, interviewed, and released without charges in exchange for cooperation. And the rest of the network, CAS, the Dubai operation, the contractor pipeline, did not, in the immediate aftermath, behave as if it had been tipped. That was the second thing about this case that did not fit. The Gulf Meridian boarding was, by any normal measure, a major operational event. It involved a public dockside seizure. The local press in Aransas Pass picked it up within 48 hours, although the federal agencies declined to comment and the story was buried under a generic ongoing investigation line. By any reasonable expectation, Blue Horizon should have suspended operations within 72 hours of the boarding. It did not. It accelerated. The acceleration was visible in the financial flow data. Between April 22 and May 15, Blue Horizon's documented purchases of marine electronics, the cover line for incoming cargo, increased by roughly 60% over the prior 30-day baseline. 3 vessels entered refit phases simultaneously, one each at Trinity Bay, Sabine Lake, and Pelican Cove. The pace of work at all 3 marinas, documented through surveillance, increased to 7-day operations with extended night shifts. Holbrook's interpretation, recorded in a May 4 task force briefing, was that Cast and his Dubai counterpart had concluded that the Gulf Meridian seizure was an isolated event triggered by a single anomalous tip and that the broader network had not been compromised. They were trying to clear inventory before any further attention developed. The Plano contractors entered the picture on May 8, 2026. A subpoenaed shipping manifest from a Houston-area marine electronics distributor showed a series of cash purchases over the previous 18 months, totaling roughly $2.3 million, all paid for by a small consultancy in Plano, Texas, listed under the name Falcon Ridge Technical Solutions. Falcon Ridge had 3 employees. 2 of them, a 53-year-old man named Thomas Falk and a 41-year-old woman named Jennifer Way, had previously held senior engineering positions at a defense prime contractor in the North Dallas corridor. Both had left that employer in 2021 and 2022, respectively, under what the company's HR records described as voluntary departures. The third Falcon Ridge employee was a junior administrator with no engineering background. The 2 of them did not buy enough marine electronics to justify $2.3 million of expenditure. What they were actually buying, the task force determined through cross-referencing shipment, records against the contents of the Gulf Meridian seizure, was guidance-grade inertial measurement units, navigation modules, and a category of forward section components that had originally been manufactured for an unrelated U.S. defense program and had on paper been classified as destroyed, defective, and removed from federal inventory in 3 separate disposal events in 2024 and 2025. The disposal paperwork had been signed off by a senior supervisor at the original program. The components had not, in fact, been destroyed. They had been diverted into Falcon Ridge's inventory and were being on-sold to Blue Horizon at component replacement value, which was being paid for out of the Noor Logistics financial flows. What this case tells us, more than anything, is that a sanctions evasion network operating at this level doesn't improvise its supply chain. It builds one, tests it, and maintains redundancy. The Plano connection, 3 former defense employees diverting inventory through a destroyed defective classification, was likely the 4th or 5th iteration of a sourcing mechanism that had been refined through earlier relationships. By the time Mendez noticed the wrong trim in February 2026, this network had been processing shipments for over 4 years. That's not luck. That's institutional knowledge applied to evasion. If you've been following this case so far and want it to land somewhere, hit the like button now. The next part is the hardest part, the surveillance window, the storm decision, and the simultaneous raids, and the algorithm uses that one signal to decide whether anyone else gets to see this. It costs you nothing. It matters more than people realize. Here's the take that will probably get pushback. The senior supervisor, whose signature appears on the destroyed defective classification paperwork for the Plano components, wasn't among the defendants in the June 4 indictment. That signature isn't Falk's, isn't Way's, and isn't the cooperating contractors. It belongs to someone still employed in the defense sector. Federal prosecutors may have their reasons, but a person who signed off on the paperwork that made $87 million in drone guidance components disappear from federal inventory is not a peripheral figure in this case. At what point does a supply chain failure become institutional negligence? And who inside the defense sector bears accountability when their own Inventory ends up in the guidance systems of drones targeting civilians? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them. The escalation in mid-May 2026 was driven by two parallel developments. The first was that Holbrook's team had finally finished the Noor Logistics financial flow analysis. The flows ran through three corporate layers across three jurisdictions, and obtaining bilateral cooperation from the United Arab Emirates to move on the Dubai side of the operation would, the State Department's preliminary assessment indicated, take a minimum of 6 to 9 weeks of bilateral diplomatic engagement before any operational handoff could occur. The Dubai side, in other words, would not be available for simultaneous action. The second development was that by May 15, the task force had identified at least 3 Blue Horizon-affiliated vessels currently in active refit phase: a 68-foot yacht at Trinity Bay, a 74-foot yacht at Sabine Lake, and a 78-foot vessel at Pelican Cove that, the surveillance team noted with some bitterness, was being prepared in the same slip where Mendez had filed his original tip on the Seaboard Pearl 4 months earlier. There was also, the task force suspected, a fourth vessel somewhere in the network, referenced in intercepted communications as Vessel 4, with no visual confirmation and no documented marina location. The intercepted comms placed the fourth vessel as already loaded and waiting for departure clearance, but the AAS transponder data the team had been monitoring showed no signal from any candidate vessel. The fourth vessel was, in effect, dark. It existed in the shipping log. It did not exist on any map the task force could draw. Retention count point, 50% mid-roll hook, repose central question about who's funding Blue Horizon. The strategic question that confronted Holbrook on May 18 was whether to wait, to let the fourth vessel surface, to continue running the surveillance, to develop more evidence on the Dubai side, to coordinate diplomatically with the UAE, to identify additional Plano-style sourcing relationships, or to execute. Waiting meant the possibility that one or more of the 3 confirmed vessels would depart before the operation could be staged. Executing meant that the fourth vessel, wherever it was, would almost certainly be alerted and would either flee or, more likely, would be repositioned by the network in a way that placed it beyond any future reach. She chose to wait on May 18. She had a target window of 2 to 3 weeks. Within that window, she believed, the fourth vessel would surface in the surveillance, the Trinity Bay vessel would complete refit and be ready for sea, and the financial flow analysis would have produced enough material on the Dubai side that the State Department could approach the UAE with a coherent request. The weather in late May 2026 did not cooperate. A tropical low-pressure system developed in the central Gulf of Mexico on May 26 and intensified over the following 72 hours into what the National Hurricane Center began tracking as a likely tropical storm formation expected to make landfall somewhere on the upper Texas coast between June 1 and June 3. The forecast cone by May 29 included Galveston, League City, Port Arthur, and Aransas Pass, every active marina in the surveillance set. A storm of the projected category would shut down marina operations for 3 to 5 days, would displace vessels, would interrupt surveillance, and would, in the assessment of Holbrook's deputy, give Blue Horizon's operational team both a reason and an opportunity to relocate inventory. The decision was made for them by a phone call. At 9:43 p.m. on May 30, someone called Raymond Cast. The call lasted 6 minutes. Cast made no outgoing calls after that. 34 hours later, the operation was underway. And in Port Arthur, a 70-foot yacht had already been moving through the dark for hours. The 9:43 p.m. call was routed through 3 intermediate switching points and could not, at the time, be traced to a specific originating number. Holbrook's team knew only that the call had occurred, that it had been 6 minutes long, that Cast had been at his home address in League City at the time, and that within 30 minutes of the call ending, Cast had driven to a private storage facility 3 miles from his home and had spent approximately 40 minutes inside the facility. He had not been observed carrying anything in or out. Surveillance did not have warranted access to the storage facility itself. The interpretation at the time was that Cast had been warned. The interpretation now, with the benefit of the later record, is essentially the same, although the identity of the caller has never been publicly confirmed. The phone records showed only that the originating switch had been a commercial VoIP service registered to a shell address in Curaçao. No further traceback was developed. The caller in operational terms remains unknown. The decision to execute simultaneously was made at 2:11 a.m. on May 31. The plan, as finalized over the following 48 hours, had four components. First, the Meridian Star, which the task force had identified through CBP targeting as the next departing vessel, and which had cleared U.S. Customs on May 28, would be tracked across the Atlantic and intercepted at sea, ideally at a transshipment port in the Mediterranean or, if her routing permitted, in the Gulf of Oman on her final approach to the receiving buyer. Second, the three Texas marinas, Trinity Bay, Sabine Lake, and Pelican Cove, would be hit simultaneously at 05 a.m. Central Time on June 2nd, with the goal of seizing the vessels still in refit and the cargo still on the docks before either could be moved. Third, arrests of Cast, Falk, Way, and roughly 19 other identified network members would be executed in parallel, also at 05 a.m. Fourth, the financial flows would be frozen, to the extent the task force had legal authority over them, at the same hour through a coordinated set of Treasury actions. If you want to know how this case develops over the next 12 months, the trials, the sentencing, the deeper questions about how this network sourced its components, subscribe before the raid sequence. That's the only way the next videos in this case reach you when they're ready. The Meridian Star was the trickiest piece. She had departed Galveston on May 25, cleared customs on May 28, and had been moving east across the Atlantic at a steady 14 knots ever since. Her declared destination was Limassol, Cyprus, with an onward sail to a private buyer in Dubai. The task force's working hypothesis, based on prior network behavior, was that the actual handoff would occur not at Limassol but at a smaller transshipment dock somewhere along the Omani coast, with the components being offloaded by a tender vessel, and the yacht continuing on under its legitimate paperwork to a final cosmetic delivery at the Dubai dock. The interception window, in other words, was somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, in international waters, before the handoff occurred. The Meridian Star's actual routing, when she emerged from the Suez Canal on the morning of June 1, confirmed the hypothesis. She turned south at the expected waypoint, transited the Red Sea, rounded the Horn of Africa at a speed and bearing that placed her on track for an Omani coastal approach at approximately 06 in local time on June 3, 26 hours after the Texas raids would execute. The window for interception was the night of June 2. The interception team had been pre-positioned aboard a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer operating in the Gulf of Oman on a routine freedom of navigation cycle. The boarding package, a combined NCIS, DSS, and CBP element of 19 personnel, had been flown out to the destroyer on May 31 via a sequence of cover flights staged through Bahrain. The team had run 2 full mission rehearsals on the destroyer's flight deck on the night of June 1. The boarding itself was scheduled for 04:30 a.m. local time on June 2, calibrated to coincide within a tolerable margin with the 05:00 a.m. Central Time execution in Texas. Retention pinpoint, last 60s payoff, deliver resolution plus Victor OC open loop. One detail that stuck with me, Carlos Mendez's original tip on February 11 was classified low priority maritime anomaly. The reviewing agent had 72 hours to look at it. The Seaboard Pearl had already left by the time anyone did. It was automated software, a pattern-matching system built for bulk commodity sanctions, not drone parts, that flagged the vessel 11 days later. The system wasn't designed for this. It just worked. The reason it worked was a single ATS rule that had been written into the system in 2017 in response to an entirely unrelated sanctions case that flagged any vessel whose ownership chain crossed a certain threshold of corporate layering complexity within a certain time window. The Seaboard Pearl's ownership chain had crossed that threshold by a margin of 2 layers. The flag had nothing to do with drones, nothing to do with Iran, nothing to do with Mendez. The flag was a residue of policy decisions made 9 years earlier for unrelated reasons. It is the only reason this case existed. The raid sequence began in the Gulf of Oman at 04:42 a.m. local time on June 2, 18 minutes ahead of the planned timeline because the Meridian Star's bearing had shifted slightly to the south, and the boarding window was narrowing. Three rigid-hulled inflatable boats, each carrying 6 personnel, launched from the destroyer's stern at maximum interval and approached the Meridian Star from 3 vectors at 26 knots. The Meridian Star's running lights were on. Her watch officer was at the wheel. The 2 crew members were in their bunks. Boarding was conducted by ladder over the port quarter at 04:47 a.m. The watch officer attempted no resistance. He was flex-cuffed within 90 seconds. The 2 crew members were secured in their bunks within 4 minutes. The vessel's master, who had been asleep in the owner's cabin, surrendered without incident and asked, through an interpreter, whether the boarding was a piracy event. The salon search began at 04:53 a.m. The forward bilge inspection produced nothing visible. The aft ballast cavity, when the reciprocating saw cut through the teak laminate, produced the first 62 cases. A wider search of the vessel, completed over the next 11 hours, as the Meridian Star was steered under prize crew to a Navy support facility, produced a total of 247 foam-packed cases distributed across 4 ballast cavities, 2 structural void compartments, and the dead space behind the freshwater system. The component count, when BS analysts had finished the inventory 3 days later, totaled 1,141 discrete items. Component value at replacement cost was estimated at $87 million. End use on the basis of component type analysis was assessed at high confidence as Shahed-series production for Urchi Aerospace Force. In Texas, the simultaneous execution began at 05 a.m. Central Time, 18 minutes after the Gulf of Oman boarding. 3 tactical teams hit 3 marinas. At Trinity Bay, a Houston FBI SWAT element supporting NCIS breached the perimeter at the eastern slip and boarded the 68-foot vessel within 14 seconds of breach. The cargo was found in the portside ballast cavity, partially loaded, with 2 crates still on the dock under a tarp. 3 suspects on the dock were detained. None of them resisted. At Sabine Lake, the situation was different. Sabine Lake had a 4th Blue Horizon vessel that the task force had not previously identified. Surveillance at Sabine Lake on the evening of June 1 had documented unusual activity. A vessel that had not appeared in any prior surveillance run, a 70-foot Viking sport yacht with no visible name on her transom, had been towed into a covered slip at the northeastern corner of the marina at approximately 8:30 p.m. The covered slip was at the edge of the surveillance camera coverage, and the vessel was visible only by its mast and upper structure. The task force had logged the event, but had not had time to develop it before the execution window opened. When the tactical team arrived at Sabine Lake at 05 a.m., the covered slip was empty. The Viking had departed. What's most surprising about the Port Arthur scenario isn't that the vessel moved. It's when it moved. 1:47 a.m., more than 2 hours before the task force's action began. Someone with access to operational timing had made a call that night. Subsequent forensic review of the marina's gate control logs showed that the Viking had cleared the channel mouth at 1:51 a.m., 4 minutes after departing her slip, and had headed east-southeast at a speed of 18 knots. CBP Marine assets had been alerted at 0:24 a.m. after the gate control review and had attempted to intercept her at the Sabine Pass Channel exit, but the Viking had cut her AIS transponder before reaching the open Gulf and had vanished from radar coverage at approximately 03:12 a.m. in the area south of High Island. Coast Guard and CBP aerial assets searched the area at first light. They found nothing. The Viking has not been seen since. Her last confirmed transponder ping was at 03:12 a.m. on June 2, 2026. Her hull configuration matched a vessel registered to a Florida holding company that was, in turn, a subsidiary of one of Blue Horizon's affiliated marina entities. Her cargo, if she was carrying any, has not been recovered. Her crew has not been identified. She is, in the public record, the 4th vessel. At Pelican Cove, Mendez's own marina, the entry was the cleanest of the 3 Texas operations. The 78-foot vessel in refit, a yacht called the Aurelia Compass, was boarded at 05 a.m. with no resistance. 2 contractors who had been working an overnight shift were detained. cargo had not yet been loaded into the cavities. Instead, the cargo, 73 foam-packed cases, was found in a refrigerated marine supply trailer in the marina's western parking lot, where it had apparently been staged for loading later that morning. Component value was assessed at approximately $34 million. The arrests, executed in parallel, produced 22 suspects in custody by 09:30 a.m. Central Time on June 2. Raymond Cast was arrested at his home in League City at 05 a.m. He answered the door in a bathrobe. He did not resist. He invoked his right to counsel within 90 seconds of being read his rights and made no further statements. His wife, who was not implicated, was permitted to remain in the home with their 2 adult children. Cast was transported to the federal detention facility in downtown Houston by 06:30 a.m. Thomas Falk was arrested at his Plano office at 05:00 a.m. by an HSI team. He made a series of statements during transport that his attorney later attempted to suppress. Jennifer Way was the only suspect who attempted flight. She had, by some indication that the task force never publicly clarified, been alerted to the approaching action sometime in the pre-dawn hours of June 2. She arrived at George Bush Intercontinental Airport at 04:18 a.m. She was turned around at the security checkpoint and rerouted by surface transportation to William P. Hobby Airport, where she attempted to board a 6:45 a.m. departure to Mexico City. She was detained at the Hobby Gate by an HSI surveillance team at 6:32 a.m. She had in her possession a carry-on bag containing 3 encrypted USB drives, a passport in her own name, and a second passport in a name that was not her own. The second passport was a high-quality forgery. 2 of the 3 USB drives were later determined to contain partial inventory records of the Plano diversion. The third was encrypted in a manner that the FBI's cryptanalysis section was, as of the most recent public filing, still working to defeat. Victor Ose, the Dubai side coordinator, was not arrested. He had departed Dubai International Airport on an 11:40 p.m. flight to Istanbul on the night of May 31, 29 hours before the U.S. operation executed. From Istanbul, he had taken a connecting flight to a third destination that U.S. authorities have not publicly identified. He has not been seen at any address known to U.S. or Emirati authorities since June 1, 2026. An Interpol red notice was issued on June 8. As of the most recent public update, his location is unknown. 2 of the Blue Horizon-linked vessels in the shipping log, ones that made international routing trips consistent with the smuggling pattern, are unaccounted for in the public indictment. If you've followed this case and heard something about the 4th vessel's destination, comment network below. We read every comment on this channel. The financial flows, frozen on June 2 through coordinated Treasury action, captured approximately $29 million in U.S. and U.S. correspondent bank accounts associated with Blue Horizon, Falcon Ridge, and 3 of the intermediate shell layers. The total transaction flow through the network, as reconstructed by HSI's financial team, was estimated at $137 million over a 4-year operational window. Of that flow, roughly $58 million had moved through accounts that were emptied between May 27 and June 1, 2026, the 5-day window between the call to cast and the execution of the operation. The $58 million has not been recovered. The accounts it moved through have not been reestablished. The receiving accounts have not been identified. The June 4 indictment named 22 defendants. The charging documents included counts under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Arms Export Control Act, the Export Control Reform Act, the federal money laundering statutes, and a conspiracy count linking all defendants to a common scheme. The maximum aggregate sentences, if all defendants were convicted on all counts, would total in the hundreds of years. The realistic sentencing exposure, given likely plea negotiations and cooperation agreements, was estimated by the U.S. Attorney's Office in informal briefings at between 15 and 30 years for the principals and shorter terms for the secondary participants. Carlos Mendez was not named in the indictment. He was named, instead, in a public statement issued by the Department of Justice on June 7, 2026, which credited an attentive marine mechanic at a Galveston area marina with the original observation that initiated the investigation. The statement did not use his name. The statement did not specify the marina. The Galveston Daily News identified him in a story 2 days later, with his permission, and ran a photograph of him standing on the dock at Pelican Cove, holding the original carbon copy fuel receipt on the back of which he had written his February 11 notes. He told the reporter that he had not thought of himself as having done anything unusual. He had thought of himself as having done his job. The trim was off. The numbers were wrong. He had reported it, because that was what you were supposed to do when the numbers were wrong. Special Agent Dana Holbrook, in a brief on-camera statement at a June 9 press conference, called the case the largest maritime sanctions interdiction since the start of the current operational environment in the Strait of Hormuz. She declined to take questions about ongoing aspects of the investigation. She specifically declined to comment on the identity of the May 30 caller, the location of Victor Ossi, or the status of the fourth vessel. She also declined to address questions about the unindicted supervisor, whose signature appeared on the Plano diversion paperwork. The case is now a federal prosecution. The trial of the principal defendants is scheduled, at the time of this writing, to begin in early 2027. The Plano diversion mechanism, the Sabine Lake fourth vessel disappearance, and the Dubai side financial architecture are all the subject of ongoing investigative work. The fourth vessel, the 70-foot Viking that departed Sabine Lake at 1:51 a.m. on June 2, has not been located. Her AIS has remained dark since 03:12 a.m. that morning. Her cargo, if any, is unrecovered. Her crew is unidentified. Carlos Mendez still works at Pelican Cove Marina. He still does pre-departure inspections. He is, by his own account, more careful now about reading the trim numbers against the paperwork. He has said publicly that he does not regret filing the tip and that he would file it again. He has also said, in a follow-up interview with a maritime trade publication, that he wonders sometimes about the 11 days. About what would have happened if a human analyst had opened the file on day 1 instead of day 11. About whether the Seaboard Pearl would have been stopped at dock. About whether the network would have been disrupted earlier, with less cargo delivered, with fewer drones built. He does not have the answer to that. Neither does anyone else. Raymond Cast is in federal pretrial detention. Thomas Falk and Jennifer Way are out on restricted bond. The supervisor whose signature appeared on the diversion paperwork has not been publicly named and has not, as far as the public record reflects, faced any administrative action from his employer. The $58 million remains missing. Victor Ossi remains at large. The fourth vessel remains dark. What this case demonstrates is not that the system worked. It demonstrates that the system caught one network, on the strength of one tip filed by one mechanic that was nearly archived, and that the catching required 11 days of luck, 4 months of coordinated investigation, and a final operational window measured in hours that opened only because a tropical storm forced a decision the task force had been trying to avoid. The components are recovered. The principals are in custody. The interdiction is the largest of its kind in the current operational environment. The demand for the components has not changed. The procurement officers in Tehran have not changed. The financial architecture that funded Blue Horizon has not been dismantled, only inconvenienced. Somewhere the next Raymond Cast is being recruited. Somewhere the next mechanism is being designed. Somewhere a 70-foot Viking is sitting in a covered slip with its transponder off, waiting for instructions. Carlos Mendez noticed the wrong trim on a yacht in February. The case that produced was the largest maritime sanctions interdiction in the current cycle. The next one is already underway. No one knows yet who will notice it.